Moving to the next portion of today's event, I would like to go ahead and welcome our moderator for today's panel, Simone Lima. Simone is an Access to Success Fellow and a current MBA student at the Rutman School of Management at the University of Toronto. She has worked at United Nations and UNAIDS in the financial sector, as well as at tech startups. Simone has been involved in the accessibility space prior to the MBA because of permanent physical disabilities of close friends and family members, as well as her own lived experiences with disability. Welcome, Simone, and over to you.
Hi, Varun. Thanks. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. I'm very excited to see a report like this shedding light into what it's like to be an MBA student with a disability. We're going to start with our panel now. So I'm going to introduce our guests, the researchers who made this report possible. So if you're a participant and you have any questions, please send them on the chat. Varun and I will keep an eye on it to make sure that all questions are answered if we do have the time. Right. So first up, we have Dr. Katherine Breward. So Katherine is an associate professor of human resource management at the University of Winnipeg. She holds undergraduate degrees in sociology and adult education, an MBA, and a PhD in organizational behavior from the Richard Ivey School of Business. Her research is centered around labor market access for historically disadvantaged populations, with a particular focus on best practices in disability accommodation. Her most recent work focuses on accommodation strategies for psychiatric disabilities and for people who are neurodiverse, a particular area of interest since Dr. Breward is autistic herself. Katherine Breward's research has appeared in Paul Grave Macmillan's Research Handbook on Disability at Work, the Canadian Journal of Disability Studies, on the Journal of Immigrant and Minority Health, Equality, Diversity, and Inclusion, and on Conversation Canada. We also have Dan Samosh, who is a postdoctoral research fellow with the Center for Industrial Relations in Human Resources at the University of Toronto and the Institute for Work and Health. He received his PhD in organizational behavior from Queen's University. Dan uses qualitative and quantitative methods to explore research questions on the career advancement, leadership, and workplace inclusions of persons with disabilities. And in July this year, he will be joining the Queen's Employment Relations Program as an assistant professor. So welcome, Dan, welcome, Katherine. Thank you both for being here. So we are going to start. So first question, since you worked on this report from the beginning, I'd like to hear your opinions on what are the most important findings on this report and why. And maybe we can start with you, Katherine.
Okay, and thank you so much for that kind introduction. There were a number of really important findings in this report, and I want to narrow my focus down to three to answer your question. The first finding is that there are a lot of different barriers that still exist. These barriers are multifaceted, and they continue to negatively impact students and potential students who are simply considering applying. The barriers occur at every single stage in an MBA program, from gathering information about which programs are of interest right through to post-graduation. And so this really highlighted the fact that we need to be paying more attention to these issues. There is this broad sense in the community that, well, why are we still talking about diversity in 2022? We've kind of done that already. And what this study highlighted is, no, we really haven't done that already. These barriers are real, they still exist, and they need attention. The second major point that came out is that there are certain challenges that are deliberately and intentionally inserted into MBA programs because of some fairly old-fashioned thinking that it mimics the work environment. So I'm talking about things like very aggressive deadlines, deliberately overloading people with more work than it's possible to do in the time frame, and having a really high emphasis on group work. And unfortunately, these sort of boundary conditions that the schools create have a disproportionate negative impact on people with disabilities. In addition, it's questionable whether they actually really replicate today's working environment, which is trying to be less stressful and less demanding. And so that was certainly an issue that we had to consider, is that these programs are structured almost deliberately to make it more difficult. And my third and final important finding is that the attitudes that individual instructors and individual peers have towards accommodation really matter. A lot of the reluctance people had to request accommodations related to the personalities of individual professors or the way they were treated by others in group work. And so the attitudes of individual people that are encountered make a huge difference in learning experiences. I'm sure Dan has some thoughts to add as well about important points.
Yeah, I'm going to echo one of Catherine's points and then also kind of add a little bit more to it as well. The first point that Katherine made, I think, is a really, really important one about how barriers are not just at one stage of the experience with an MBA, but that they persist across the kind of continuum of what an MBA is, from pre-admission all the way to exit from a program and entering a job. And I think that's really important because when you think about some of the barriers within this study, some of them are quite extreme. Some of them might be smaller in terms of their intensity or their effect on an individual. But when you remember that time is a factor here and that barriers begin from often the moment someone tries to engage in a standardized test, or even prior to that potentially, all of these both big and small barriers kind of come together to create a really additive and in some cases multiplicative experience that can be very burdensome and that can really hamper someone's career. So whether it be hampering the ability to enter an MBA program, whether it be hampering the ability to succeed while in the program or to get a job after, these barriers are quite multifaceted and they add together. The second point is, and I think really important, because rather than discussing barriers, which are absolutely important, but considering the way forward, how do we make things better? How do we change these issues? Is that one of the things that we found about accommodation, which is also found in the general accommodation literature in the workplace, not just within the school system, within MBAs, is that the majority of accommodations that students require to succeed, to get into the program, succeed in the program, get a job after, those accommodations didn't cost anything for the most part. And what they really required was flexibility. So that is really important, because what it means is that if we have more awareness, if we have motivation, if we have some degree of effort on the part of programs, on the part of the people who craft these programs and influence the student experience, then we can actually make programs more accessible and inclusive. So those are my 2 points for the time being.
Perfect. Thank you both for that. And then we're going to continue with you. So on the topic of barriers that potential students face even before entering the MBA program, right? So let's try to do this chronologically. So based on your findings, how can schools adapt to make sure that there are more students with disabilities applying to MBA programs?
Yeah, of course. So first, to answer that, I'll just talk a little bit about the pre-admission stage and how the primary barrier that we heard from people at that stage was really about accommodation and fair access to standardized testing. About a quarter of respondents, just slightly less than a quarter, commented that standardized testing was a major barrier to their entry, which is a huge proportion, right, of our respondents. But other concerns at that stage were also things like issues with reference letters, submission materials, concerns about accommodation and flexibility and class size, things like future stigmatization, potential unmet accessibility needs, a host of concerns that, although they aren't during the application themselves, they are concerns at the application stage that students have that might stop them from entering a program. So because of that, I think one of the first things that a program can do to have more applicants with disabilities, to convince more students or more potential students with disabilities that they should apply, is to demonstrate that students with varying experiences of disability actually succeed in programs and after programs. I think it's paramount. I know in this study and also in my own research, I have talked to many, many people who say, I'm interested in an MBA, but I don't think that I'll get a job after, given how my disability is perceived, so I won't be applying. And these are people who, in my perspective, would do very well in an MBA if that MBA was inclusive and accessible. So Beyond that too, there are lots of opportunities to increase visibility of accessibility and inclusion within programs after that work has been done. There are things like proactively advertising the availability of disability supports and accommodations. Programs can profile more students with disabilities in their marketing material, showcasing that students with disabilities are students here. This isn't just an ableist environment. This is an environment where everyone will be included. Another point that our respondents talked about was the importance of hiring more faculty with disabilities, and as well engaging in proactive outreach and recruiting of students with disabilities. So, and this is something that we'll probably come back to as this discussion goes on, rather than putting the onus on the individual, on the applicant or the student, reaching out to people and recruiting, saying we are accessible, we are inclusive, and we want students with disabilities. There are also options like providing specific financial support that is disability specific. And one of our findings as well, and a suggestion from respondents, was the potential to either one, make standardized testing more accessible, so remove the varied barriers that we describe in the report to standardized testing, or two, really ask, is this standardized test a measure of success and entry into our program? And if not, consider waiving it.
Perfect, thank you for that. And then Katherine, moving on to you, you mentioned the intensity of the MBA program and how the idea is really to put students in what should be the environment that they are going in, the work environment that they're joining after the MBA. So the intensity of the MBA program is really well known, well established, and it seems to be one of the most inaccessible components of MBA programs, right? So what is the best way forward? How can business schools really find a balance between the intensity of deliverables and students' health and accommodating for students with disabilities?
Well, it's a great question because, first of all, you're absolutely correct in that intensity is done absolutely on purpose. They will deliberately, in most MBA programs, give you more work than it is possible to do in the time period to see how you handle that and so on. And so this is very, very deliberate. But I think it's something that not just as people interested in the disability community, but as a broader community, we really have to take a step back and think about. It's well documented that stress and anxiety actively interfere in learning. This is incontrovertible. There are so many studies that demonstrate this that there's basically no argument about this. So by deliberately building a program that maximizes stress and anxiety, you are actively minimizing learning, and not just for students with disabilities, but for all of your students. And I think we need to ask, is that really a desirable outcome? Because at this point, it's no longer about accommodating disability. It's about accommodating everyone's learning. And this is an important point. A lot of so-called disability accommodations would actually do everybody some good. Having a less stressful, less anxiety-inducing program would benefit every single student. The whole idea of pushing people until they break is actually an artifact of toxic masculinity. If you really sit down and think about it, the idea that the best people are the ones that can deal with overwhelming stress without cracking, it is a bit toxic in a culture that is moving towards an enlightened model that acknowledges mental health and acknowledges that people have other needs outside work. And so I think that the broader things we do as a culture to move away from that toxic masculinity, our portrayals of ideal men in the media, for example, are all part of this broader movement of moving away from that mentality. And so it really requires a broader change in mentality. MBA degrees should not be endurance challenges. When you make them endurance challenges, you not only exclude people with disabilities, but you exclude single parents. You exclude people that are having to care for their elderly parents. You are excluding people that need to do it part-time so that they can earn a living at the same time. You exclude people that are on an immigration stream and have certain work requirements to maintain their immigration stream. And so this idea of making it an endurance challenge doesn't work for a lot of people. And as we move more towards things like triple bottom line reporting and corporate social responsibility and broader mental health awareness, I think this is part of that bigger picture. to move away from these deliberately stressful programs and offer something that's frankly a little more person-friendly for everyone and a little more enlightened. I also just want to comment very, very briefly on the prevalence of group work in MBAs. Group work does dominate MBAs. There is nothing inherently disability unfriendly about that. What happens, though, is that a lot of people still have stereotypes and biases against people with disabilities. And so we got a lot of reports that when people with visible disabilities were put into group work, that they were treated as a burden, their ideas weren't listened to, that they were treated disrespectfully by their colleagues. And so until MBAs are prepared to ensure that groups interact respectively with each other, they need to think about the merits of having courses that have like 80% of your mark based on group work. Because if you just show up at the table and everyone says, we don't want to listen to you because of who you are, well, you can't participate in that process. And so these are program areas that need careful consideration.
Perfect. And I also believe, just chiming in here, that as workplaces are becoming a little bit more person-friendly and a little bit less of an endurance challenge, I believe this can, spill over to the MBA as well. I hope, certainly do hope so. Thank you for that. Then Dan, back to you. What are some of the ways, and this is an attendee question that we got before the event, right? So what are some of the ways that the MBA programs can universally design the resources that are actually accessible and can be used by students with disabilities, and even, as Katherine was mentioning, students without disabilities that would benefit for them? Like, what do schools still need to do to adapt and make sure that the students are aware of the resources that are available to them?
Yeah, so I think just kind of more broadly around what schools need to do in terms of resources and also just policy and practice. In most cases, from this report and other research too, there's a great need for schools to shift thinking away from putting the onus all on the individual in terms of their student experience, their accommodation, their access, and to start generating processes, practices, and especially systems that are really proactive and flexible, right? And those two words, like proactive and flexible, I think are very, very important to this discussion all the way through. And there are some ways that organizations and MBA programs can do that that are a little bit more concrete. The first is that the term universal design is often used, but perhaps not everyone knows that there are 7 principles of universal design, and they should be considered whenever a practice is being put in place, whenever a policy, a process, anything. It very clearly, step by step, within an educational environment can help organizations learn how to do this. Some ideas, kind of more core to programs, could be things like asking, what is the core purpose of our program or this learning experience? In the same way that when we try to design accessible and inclusive job applications, we need to ask, what are the true components of this job, right? Do we really need someone with 5 to 10 years of experience, or is it something else? The same thing with the programs. What Katherine mentioned, do we really need this intensity, this kind of toxic masculinity-oriented approach, or is the world out there that MBA students are entering completely different than the world that we are trying to create for them within this program? And how can we really know what our core is and then be inclusive around that core and really try to individualize the experience beyond that? One really important way that I think this can be done that is very actionable is that MBA programs can, in all of their decision-making that relates to students, include persons with disabilities in those decisions, have representation there, and also ask for feedback after practices and policies and such are put into place. And as described earlier, I think one of the most important things to be done here is to build flexibility into processes, right? To make sure that first we're proactive, we include persons with disabilities in the process early on, and then later on, when a program is created, when a course is created, we're still taking feedback and we're still flexible to the individual, depending on their needs. Some more really specific things that can be done that relate to the universal design literature especially are the importance of minimizing physical need within a program. An example here is that in the Queen's MBA program, the program begins with a very, very physically intense entry activity that is supposed to build a sense of camaraderie and friendship and team membership among the different community members of MBAs. And of course, what this unintentionally does is also exclude anyone who can't engage in those physical activities. So we know there are many other ways to build that sense of community. And so to consider everyone when thinking about those activities, especially those early socialization activities, because as Katherine mentioned earlier, there is a side to this that is social. It's not just what's happening in the classroom in terms of course content and learning. It's also about group activities and about social functions after classroom hours and this sort of thing.
Thank you. And still on the topic of accommodation, now on to you, Katherine. 2 out of 3 respondents in the report mentioning having formal accommodation needs, which just over a quarter of them requested accommodations, right? So common reasons that were cited for not requesting accommodations included finding the process itself daunting, lacking formal diagnostic paperwork that they could present to the university, fearing stigmatization, and internalized ableism. So what are some of the, now shifting the focus a little bit to what is going well, what are some of the success cases when it comes to communicating these processes to students, and what could schools be doing differently in terms of communication to get these messages across?
Well, sorry, there was a 3-part question, and because I'm autistic and it's a 3-part question, I lost the first part by the time you got to the 3rd part. So what was the first part?
No
again?
worries at all. The first part, which was just like bringing in some data from the report. So the last part is what are some of the success cases when it comes to communicating these processes, the accommodation processes to students?
Okay. So first I'll comment on why people don't request to begin with. And although there are multiple reasons that people don't request accommodations, this finding is consistent with a lot of other research in workplaces that also show that a lot of people with disabilities never request their needed accommodations. So this is a broader problem, not just an MBA problem. And one of the primary reasons that we see this reluctance is fear of stigmatization and marginalization, because there is still a lot of that going on in the workplaces. And so anything we can do to reduce stigmatization of disabilities in the broader community is also going to be helpful at this level. Regarding the processes themselves, the processes tend to be bureaucratic. There tends to be a lot of paperwork involved, and you have to track a lot of steps in the process, which is of course inherently hostile to people with conditions like attention deficit disorder, for example. So making the process itself less daunting vis-a-vis specific disabilities would be helpful. But let's again talk about some of the things that have been done right and some of the things that are helpful. So one of the things we found in the report that was really helpful was schools that proactively make their accommodation process information very visible. So it shouldn't be something that's on, your 10th click into a web page on a university site. It should be front and center as soon as you go to the application site. There should be very clear information about disability accommodation. That does 2 things. Not only does it make the process actually easier because they find the information, but it also serves as a cultural signal that this is something you actually care about and prioritize, not something you bury on a back page somewhere. And that cultural signaling is just as important as actually enabling the process itself. Also, individual instructors make a huge difference because many people find that they need accommodations in one class but not another. There can be various reasons for that. It could be different subject matter. It could be one class is 3 hours, the others are an hour, whatever it is. Sometimes accommodations come down to individual classes. And so instructors need to proactively communicate that they support the accommodation process and that they consider it valid. You should say this on your very first day in class, and you should proactively encourage students to use the process, because again, that sends the signal that I'm not going to judge and stigmatize you for identifying that you had a disability. This is legitimate, this is valid, this is something we respect. You should also model usage of accommodations in marketing materials. We had several schools that actually had pictures of people with disabilities in their marketing materials or faculty with disabilities. That was always very appreciated by candidates. And finally, consider options for diagnostic paperwork. A lot of times diagnostic paperwork in itself is a barrier. I'm actually encountering this myself right now, because I just asked my employer for an accommodation for my autism, and they said, great, we just need a medical diagnosis. Well, the trouble is my last medical diagnosis occurred when I was 11. And no one is interested in seeing medical histories from when I'm 11. And in fact, they're not even accessible to me anymore because of a physician passing away and me moving. And so I'm now in a position where I'm having to go and pay out of my pocket $3,000 for an autism assessment, because adult autism assessments are not covered under provincial healthcare plans. Now, for me, I'm a professor. Although I would prefer to spend money elsewhere, I can afford $3,000 for an assessment. For an MBA candidate who's underemployed and just trying to get into a school program that's going to cost them tens of thousands of dollars, that extra $3,000 is a huge barrier. And so, you know what? If you were autistic when you were 4 or 6 or 11, you may be astonished to hear that you're still going to be autistic when you're 25 or 30 or 40 or 50. And so it makes no sense that we are asking people to go and get this paperwork that they have to pay for. There's just no valid reason for it. And so reconsidering that diagnostic paperwork requirement, or at a minimum, accepting paperwork from childhood, would remove barriers for a lot of people.
Perfect, thank you for that. And I feel like that connects very nicely with what Erin just said on the chat as well, that having to dig for disability or accessibility info on websites while you're looking for an MBA program is always a red flag. Making sure that these are out there and very visible for people who are potentially joining the program is definitely the way to go. Then also on the accommodation side of things, we have another attendee question here. It says that many universities say that they have disability services, right? But they don't have the capacity to provide students with the support that they need. To your knowledge, what MBA programs have the capacity to support students with multiple / intersecting disabilities, and how are they doing that?
Yeah, so I wish I had a quick and easy answer to this question to say, these are the universities that are the accessible and inclusive universities. Further, I mean, in this report, our research was across universities, so we didn't gather enough university-specific data to really make kind of statements of that nature. But one resounding response that we did hear is that in most cases, some degree of self-advocacy is going to be required, regardless of where you study, and at least at some stage during your experience. And a big part of why that is that the program level is one level, and it's a very important level of understanding the experience of access within a program. But often access varies by professors, by classmates, and by other factors. And so that's going to change perhaps by course that you're in. So the good news with this, in part, is that there are organizations like Access to Success who exist to help support people along those journeys. So an individual isn't alone in that. And there are other organizations too, like I know there's NEADS, the NEADS. They're the National Educational Association of Disabled Students. They do some amazing, amazing work around access and kind of getting the supports that one might need. But to just add to this in terms of, like, let's say, I'm not sure who exactly is asking the question, but perhaps you're a prospective student and you're looking for a program and trying to decide on a program. If that happens to be the case, then I think some of the most kind of powerful things you can do are talk to current students, exploring more information on disability accommodation and access at the universities that you're interested in, talk to administrators, go to websites, and look for that accommodation information. Katherine very poignantly commented right on the signaling of universities around inclusion and disability inclusion specifically. So look, I think, for the schools that are talking about these issues.
If I can just add very quickly to that, it's also important to talk to your instructors about any potential accommodation needs before the issue comes up. A half hour before your assignment is due is not the time to call up the instructor and say, I have this issue going on, because it frankly seems less credible. It's an unfortunate reality. However, if you've talked to your instructors beforehand, and so this isn't coming out of the blue at the last minute, and if you've prepared them for the possibility that these issues might arise, they're more likely to, if I can be blunt, believe you. And they're more likely to be understanding. So don't leave those discussions until the last minute.
Thank you for that. And on the topic, now we discussed a little bit about how going into an MBA program can be daunting. And then during the MBA program, the experience can also be daunting for students with disabilities. And then respondents also reported negative experiences, including bias, stereotyping, ableism, along with inaccessible recruiting experiences when they were recruiting both for internships and full-time, right? So we're gonna touch on that a little bit now. So in the report, you found out that 40% of respondents who had graduated reported being unemployed or involuntarily unemployed after the MBA program ended. So what can be done in this intersection of student, school, and the market, and how can schools, better prepare companies that are recruiting to accommodate students as well?
That's a great question. And just before I address it, I want to highlight for any students with disabilities that are listening to this, I don't want them to see that 40% number and get overly discouraged, because I do need to point out that this data was collected during the pandemic, which was just generally a weird time for job searches and employment. And it was unclear in our data how many people were underemployed as a direct result of their disabilities and how many were having job search challenges due to the pandemic. So while I do believe that there are many problems, the problems may not be as severe as that data would suggest. And that's something that future research will have to take a look at. That said, there is no question that there are problems with the recruitment process. There are inequities and there are barriers. So some of the things that have worked well to address that are having specialist career center staff who specifically specialize in placing students with disabilities. So there are already a wide number of agencies that help with this. Lately, autism is one of the areas where we're seeing all kinds of agencies that specialize in placing people with autism. And you basically want to replicate that within your career center. So have someone that has particular expertise in finding disability-friendly employers, recruiting and maintaining relationships with them, and helping them meet students on campus. Those career center staff also have to have a longer tenure to be effective. We saw a lot of students complaining about a very high turnover in the career center. Every time they went in, there would be a different staff person working there, which made it much more difficult for them to develop a way to reach out to employers that was effective. And so we need to make that more of a career role and provide wages and respect that would draw people to stay in that job for a longer period of time and develop that tacit knowledge to help place students with disabilities. You also need to look at the recruitment events themselves. Recruitment events often take the form of a cocktail party where everyone's expected to network with the employers. And this creates multifaceted barriers for people with disabilities. For people with hearing impairments, cocktail parties are inherently noisy and difficult environments to navigate. Some people with vision impairments had similar problems. There was one person who almost walked into a pool because there was an outdoor recruitment event. They were blind. It was just a wander around cocktail party and no one told them there was a pool in the middle of the room. So they nearly walked into it. People with social anxiety and communication challenges struggle in the cocktail party environment. And so I think we really need to go beyond the cocktail party and networking event. We need to think beyond that in our recruitment and start creating recruitment opportunities for people with sensory sensitivities and hearing impairments and these other things. You should also reduce course workloads during the primary on-campus recruiting period. So recruitment usually happens in about a 2-week window. On most campuses, you get a whole bunch of employers come in at once. It would be really nice if you didn't have 5 midterms and 3 assignments due at the same time, right? So it would be nice if faculty could get together to plan for a slightly reduced course load during that high demand period. And also work on indirectly reducing employer bias by modeling and advertising initiatives that really highlight the competencies and capabilities of all your students, including some students with disabilities.
Thank you so much for that. And then moving on to our last question, because I want to make sure you both have the time to answer it. Dan, we can start with you. What do you believe is next? What, business schools could be doing in the MBA ecosystem to make sure that the MBA experience is more accessible for students with disabilities and it's more inclusive?
Yeah, so I think one of the first and most important things to be done, because faculty hold so much power over the experience of inclusion and administrators as well, is to train faculty and administrators for relevant skills around inclusion. And what I mean there, in part, is that awareness is a good first step, but it is not enough. We know from the diversity and inclusion literature that really what people need are skills if you're going to build environments that are inclusive. So these kind of individuals need to learn about accommodation. Examples from this report are just how simple and important flexibility can be, right? And what different versions of accessibility look like in the MBA environment. Learning about things like disclosure and why people don't disclose as well, building knowledge of different impairments, building knowledge of accessible technologies, and so on. I think second, programs need to remember that disability inclusion needs to be on the mind outside of the course and kind of coursework environment as well, right? That access is not only about extra time on exams. It's also about when people from outside of the university come in for recruiting events. It's during off-campus socialization events, during other social interactions, and also during the experience of standardized testing. And to be, within this context, asking, do we need standardized testing? And if so, how do we make it more accessible? Now, the last point that I'll make here is that I think it's really important for programs to talk to their students, and specifically talk to their students with disabilities. Our research is across universities. It's also across countries. It's a global study, which is a tremendously beneficial starting point for universities to develop and change, right? However, the barriers and the facilitators that we describe are going to present differently by university, depending on internal processes, capacity, and ability to resolve those barriers. So I think it's really important to take what we've done as a first step towards building that into your MBA program. And a part of that might be doing an internal inclusion audit and turning to who, in my opinion, are MBA program's greatest strengths, which are their students, to learn more about how to do better.
Perfect, thank you. How about you, Katherine? What do you believe are the things that business schools should be focusing to make the MBA experience a bit more accessible and inclusive?
Well, I certainly agree with Dan that better trained administrators and instructors, that's a big part of it. And as Dan mentioned, that's skill training as well, not just abstract, don't be biased training, but something a little more concrete. Also clearer and more user-friendly accommodation processes, as I've already mentioned, more manageable workloads. But I also think we need to pay more attention to peer dynamics and peer education, particularly because MBA programs focus to such a high degree on group work. And there were some absolutely heartbreaking stories that emerged. There was one student who was a wheelchair user who they had formal university funded social events for their entire class, their entire cohort, that were in locations that were not wheelchair accessible 6 times in a row. Let me repeat that, 6 times in a row. Formal university sanctioned social events for the entire MBA class were held in facilities that were not wheelchair friendly, 6 times. Now, how is that, how much do you feel you matter now if you're that student? Another student who was also a wheelchair user had them plan a major social event at an inaccessible venue. And then they went en masse in a group to this individual, stood over them and said, we've already planned this event in this venue and everyone's super excited about it, but we understand you can't go. So if you want to come, we'll change it for you. Now that's not a real invitation. That is telling someone you're too inconvenient for us and we want you to say it's okay for us to exclude you. I mean, those are horrible things to do to somebody in an education program, and this is coming from peers. And so even if the faculty and admin were perfect, MBA students would still be facing these challenges with their peers. And that means that we need to do some peer education and some awareness training right at the beginning of MBA programs to avoid these dynamics. And finally, my last comment, don't forget it's not just about what business schools can do, it's also about what we, members of the disability community, can do. And so I want to reiterate what Dan said, organize. Political power comes from groups like Access to Success. Join these groups, get involved in them, be part of them, because this is where we're going to drive change from. Margaret Mead very famously said that a small group of people with a committed cause is not only can change the world, but is the only thing that ever will. Well, here's our small group. Come join our cause.
Thank you so much for that. Thank you, Dan, Katherine, Varun. I'm going to send it back to you.
Thank you, Simone. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining this discussion. This has been an incredibly powerful conversation. First and foremost, Katherine and Dan, thank you again for all of your incredible hard work, all of the work that you've done over the last 2 years in making this study come to fruition. And what I want to say now is, I know it sounds like this is the conclusion, the way I'm saying these things, but it's not. The truth is, I actually realized this myself, literally, I think yesterday. I was thinking that it's the conclusion of 2 years of work that we've been doing. But the truth is, this is the beginning. This is the beginning of real change that we can make. As David Grayson pointed out in the chat, we can do more work to get this information out to international conferences with more researchers. We can work with more business schools. We can work with more leaders in the disability space. And when I say we, I don't just mean Access to Success or Katherine or Dan or Simone. I do mean each and every one of us. Not to get a little bit touchy-feely here, but I really believe that time has never, ever been better to make accessibility a reality for everybody. With everything that has happened in the last 2 years, with everybody realizing that how important mental health is for everybody, there is no reason why we can't continue doing better now as we are getting into this endemic phase, hopefully. So hopefully those change makers will be all of you who spent this hour this afternoon with us. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining, and enjoy the rest of your day. Bye-bye.